Okay, this time I'm gonna try something new. So I've never done a video on this where I've just full force fucking gone out into the ether of the unknown and tried to figure something out. And I want to try this. So it was brought to my attention either I think through a combination of my own values and faith and the Sam's together. I've been trying to figure, and it's in there somewhere, the definition of the limit in between modality, the field of modality, and whatever is beyond it. Now, classical logic is objective, cannot be false. We know that. Modal logic is relative, depends on where you are. Therefore, the next field should be subjective. And this is where things can get very scary. They can be scary. So, what is it that makes something possible? What is it that defines what a mode is? So each mode or environment has a center, a volume, and a periphery. Because if they didn't, there'd be no way to define them from other modes. At the very least, they have to have a periphery. They have to have an edge. What is it that defines the edge of the mode? The edge of the mode is defined at the point at which things start to disintegrate necessarily. They cannot integrate anymore. Now, what is it that causes things to integrate is the volume and the center. So the volume is actually where the integration happens. The periphery is defining where it cannot happen anymore. And that's what makes something impossible. And that is what makes a mode. So any mode is defining what is inside of itself as possible and outside of itself as impossible. So according to each mode, all the other modes are impossible, because that's what excludes those modes from being included or integrated with that mode. So according to nothing, being is impossible. According to nothing, indiscernibility is impossible. And according to indiscernibility, being and nothing are both impossible. And according to being, nothing and indiscernibility are both impossible. So the impossibility of the other modes is what's excluding them from being integrated into that mode. And the thing that's making it impossible for them to integrate is that their central axiom, which is what makes them a mode and defines what it is to be that mode, is mutually exclusive to the others. So in any given mode, irregardless of whether or not there's three, etc., in any given mode, there must be a central axiom which is assumed to be true, and that assumption comes from somewhere. So what it is to define what it is to be a mode is defined by its central axiom. Its central axiom is defined by something subjective, which is a subjective value set. And where does that subjective value set come from? It comes from faith. And faith is subjective. It's not relative, because you can't determine in any mathematical equation or in any logical form why one value is worth more to one subject than another, or another mode. There's no way to logically determine that. It has exceeded the limits of relativity. It has exceeded the limits of logic. It is no longer a rationally deducible item. It is something that is necessarily beyond the limits of logic, and at that point it must be subjective, and it must then therefore be an art, which makes God an artist, and everything in creation is an art. And the masterpiece of God's artistry is this present moment, this constant creation of everything else that is not God. That is where everything comes from. So then, is it then possible to prove that there is a God? Given the limits of modality, given the fact that there must be multiple modes, there cannot be only one, otherwise there would not be any need for modality. Then, given the multiplicity of modes, there must be a subject which defines the central axioms of these modes. And given the fact that there are at least 3 absolute modes which are self-evident, does that then mean that those 3 modes are their own subjects and that they create themselves? And or does that mean that there's a God that is beyond them that defined those for them? Okay, hold on, I gotta take a pee break. Okay. It means that there must be a subject which is beyond those modes which are defining those modes. Is this thing still going? Okay, good. Okay, so it means that there must be some subject that is defining those modes. Do those modes even really exist then? Or are they just figments of my own imagination? And here we go back to solipsism again. Did I invent these modes? The mode of nothing, the mode of being, and the mode of indiscernibility. The mode of nothing, the mode of everything, and the mode of anything, depending on how you want to define it. Did I invent that, or was it already there? According to the Dark Crystal, it must have already been there. Okay? At which point there must then be a God who invented it first. And I, as a finite subject, have discovered this invention of God's and am now employing it to try to tease out the limits of everything, the limits of all things. So, while it doesn't prove God, it does prove that there must be a subjective field, because there must be something that exists beyond the limits of modality, which are the limits of relativity, in order to arrive at modality. Because without a subjective field, the field of relativity could not exist. Because how could we possibly define the relativistic limits of a mode without going beyond that mode, just as we saw with nothing? The only way to resolve these problems or paradoxes is to go one step beyond the limits of the field to which these paradoxes emerge. So that must then mean that there must be a field of subjectivity, which is arbitrating what a mode is, its central axiom, and therefore the definitional peripheral limit of what is and is not that mode, and the integrative process through the volume of that mode. All 3 of which are resting on an arbitration of subjective value. So subjective value then determines relativistic value ultimately, which then means that there is a hierarchy. And this hierarchy goes at the bottom level, there is objective classical logic, and then there's modal logic, which is relativistic, and then there's subjective, I don't even know if I could use the word logic anymore, subjective evaluation or arbitration. There is subjective arbitration at the core of everything in existence, and I've believed this for a very long time. I have had this notion that everything in existence is made out of souls. It's made out of subjects. And because of that, there's a subjective field, and therefore there must be a subjective totality, and therefore there must be a God. Whatever the totality is of all those subjects, there must be a subjective field, The God of that subjective field could be a God which created that subjective field, or is the totality of it, or both. And since we've reached the limit of logic, I cannot prove it. I can't prove or disprove or even evaluate which of those is true. Isn't that conspicuously interesting? How is it the case that this always happens? How is it the case that there's always room for error, that there's always room for choices, that there's always room for doubt and faith? Why is there always that room? Who invented that room? Who is the builder of that room in this mansion? There must have been someone who constructed it, and yet I cannot prove that that person exists. I've always wanted to. How then does one make a subjective evaluation of something if it isn't logical? Well, let's look at things. Aha! So, again with the three. If this is a subjective field, it must be ruled by subjective operations. The only subjective operation that I'm aware of is independence. The other two are consistency or integration, which is relativistic, and interactivity, which is objective. So if it's not objective interactivity and it's not relativistic integration, then it must be subjective independence. And that subjective independence was given as a gift to us from God, and it is the most valuable gift that anyone could ever give anyone. The gift of freedom, the gift of independence. That we can make logic serve us, that we can make our mind serve our soul, that we can make the world, as we see it as humans, typically objective physically, serve our mental paradigmatic structures of logic, which then serve our subjective, spiritual, evaluative arbitrations. What is it that separates one arbitration from another arbitration without using modes? Because modes are not yet in existence inside the field of relativity. Inside the field of subjectivity. Inside the field of subjectivity, the modes have yet to be. So we cannot use those as measures anymore. We are now in a realm of subjectivity only. And inside of that field, there must be a way to distinguish the value, the subjective value of one thing over another. And this is God's throne room. This is God's canvas. This is the painting as it is being painted. What is that? What is the measure by which we make these arbitrations? The measure by which we say one subjective value is worth more to us as a subject than another subjective value. It speaks to us. What does that mean? I'm tempted to say integration, but that's not it. That's after the fact. That's after we've already made this arbitration. We then, after the fact, rationalize it. That's what we always do. What happens before the rationalization happens? How did we make that assertion that something has more subjective value than another? How did we make that judgment? I like something, or I don't like something. What is liking something? What is wanting? What is wanting? I find things that speak to me. I find things that make sense to me. I find things that I like. I find things that I have an affinity for. But these are all integrative, logical rationalizations. What happens before that? What is it that makes something independent? It is an absence of dependence, but it is not necessary. What is the presence there? It's an absence of dependence. What is it a presence of? I'm tempted to say choice, but that's not the right answer. What is it that makes something subjectively valuable without the use of logic? There are changes. I am not the same person that I was when I was a baby. I'm still trying to use logic. I can't. Oh, this is the realm. This is the ultimate of all ultimates. What is this? How does one feel? Okay, I can either say, what is it that makes something independent? I have the freedom. What is the freedom? What is freedom? The absence of dependence. But what is the presence of that? The presence of freedom is what is it? What is the presence of freedom? There is a flow. There is a flow. So then God would be that flow, or the environment. And I can go with that or against it. I can go against it with faith if I have faith. What is it that gives me faith? What is it that gives me not logically, before the logic happens, what is it that gives me the faith? What is it that constitutes a belief? What is it that justifies my arbitrations? There is a presence of something. What is this presence? I like beer. I like to drink beer. Why do I like to drink beer? Because it makes me feel good. What is this feeling good? That's the integration between my value and my action. And when I feel bad or I feel guilty, it's because there's some contradiction or a disintegration between what I subjectively value and what I have represented and done, what I have said and thought and done. And there's a disintegration or a contradiction between that and what I value. Now, how did I figure out what is valuable? I can make one of two assumptions here. I can either assume that everything is good. I can assume that something is good. I can assume that nothing is good. I can assume that either nothing is good, anything, any specific relativistic finite thing is good, or I can assume that everything is good. What makes God God is God assumes that everything is good. That's why he gave us this choice. Now, what is it that made God say that everything is good? Because it involves not only himself, but it also involves his environment. And that is what allows for the integration beyond the arbitration. Because if I make the assumption that only some things are good or that nothing is good, then I cannot integrate outside of the field of relativity. But that still isn't it, because it's still leaning on relativity. It's still leaning on logic. It's still saying the reason that I find something valuable is because of logical reasons, so that I can integrate with my environment, which is logical and relativistic, how I relate to my environment. So then maybe it isn't a vertical hierarchy. Maybe it's a horizontal dynamism, where the subjective is justified only by the relative and the objective, and the relative is justified by the objective and the subjective, and the objective is justified by the relative and the subjective. And given that, then we have reached the limit of all possible identification and discernibility in relativity. At that point, I can no longer proceed. And there's a necessary limit to this. I can justify my subjective arbitrations and evaluations only with the field of relativity and the field of objectivity. I can only justify it through logic and reason, or logic and facts, whatever you want to say. But I can't justify it without logic or facts. Unless there either is a subject or there is not a subject. If there is a subject, then that subject can be independent. The presence of the self. Is my self present? When I like something, the presence of myself unfolds. And when I dislike something, the presence of myself withdraws. And so what makes something subjectively valuable before logic even happens is, does it make my subject unfold or withdraw? What is it that makes my subject unfold or withdraw? Is the relativistic distinction between my subject and the thing that I'm interacting with. That's a relativistic logical outcome. But what is it that makes my soul the way that it is before that happens? And at that point, I can't use logic, so why would I even bother trying to rationalize something that's clearly beyond the limits of rationality? Shit. Why do I like what I like and dislike what I dislike? There's no logical reason for it. And yet, I feel a conviction. Where did this conviction come from? Where did my nature come from? My nature is a set of properties. What is a property? A property, a qualia, is the subjective part of what is a subjective whole. So if we were to take the entire subjective field of this and that and the other and blah, 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 and all the things that make me feel things, not the feelings themselves, but the things that make me feel things, and we take all of those into account, some of those are in me and some of those are not in me, excluded. The property itself is a finite part of an infinite whole, and so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the infinite and reduce it to the finite. At this point, I don't feel like there's any room left. At this point, I wonder if there really is a hierarchy where there's God, and then there's the subjective field, and then there's the relativistic field, and finally there's the objective field of manifestation, where the effect finally reveals itself. If there is a linear hierarchy, God, subjectivity, relativity, objectivity, from top down, if that really is there, then there's no way of me ever determining why it is that I have this nature, why it is that I have these feelings, why it is that I have this faith and this evaluative subjective structure of arbitration before there even is logic. If there is not this hierarchy, then the only way to justify it would be through the other two. And then there's the causal dynamism and everything is horizontal. So the question is everything vertical or horizontal? Is there a God, or is it all just causally dynamic? It can't be causally dynamic because bootstrapping is illogical. There is no infinite regress. There is no possibility. That is impossible. Because there would not be the one to justify the other. If they only justify each other, they can't simultaneously come into existence, because there is not yet any way of measuring the other. It's through the dynamism that happens. So I think the dynamism is the process, and the hierarchy is the processor. I have reached my limit. The only thing that I can say that would justify the subjective is God. There's only two ways of justifying a subjective feeling. I can either justify it through a combination of relativity and objectivity, that is, logic and empiricism, or I can say God. It's either horizontal or it's vertical, but there's something that makes my nature the way that it is. It could also be random chance. Through random chance, did the field of relativity and the field of objectivity spontaneously and randomly assert themselves? How would they possibly have asserted themselves? They could have been brought into existence by subjectivity, but then where did subjectivity come from? Then subjectivity would have had to come from where it went, and that doesn't make sense. So I think there is the proof of logic, or God, that I can't say that subjectivity is justified solely through relativity and objectivity, because relativity and objectivity didn't exist yet in order to justify subjectivity, unless there's a hierarchy or they all spontaneously emerged at once. And I don't see how that could possibly happen without a God that's beyond them that created them. So then there must be a God that created all three of them and then justified them not only with each other, but also through himself, through God's self. That's the only way that I can describe it, because bootstrapping doesn't work. The causal dynamism, while it is beautiful, can't explain where it came from. Where did the causal dynamism between the three absolutes come from? Where did the causal dynamism between subjectivity, relativity, and objectivity come from? Because there had to be something that put them into motion that was beyond all three of them, and that could only be God. At that point, then, there would then be a need, a necessity for God, because there is no longer a logical, empirical, or even artistic way of describing how all this came to be without deferring to some unknown creator that created art, logic, and science all together as one unity. And then that must be God. But that's still, there's nowhere to go except that. I can't simply say, oh, I could say this. Where did God come from? So then we can ask that question. Where did God come from? Maybe God came from all the randomness. Maybe it's because God was the only one that had the full total faith, the absolute faith in all things, in the value of all things. And because God randomly chose that, just because, that's what makes God God. Aha. So, oh, okay. So then, okay. Because there cannot be anything else outside of subjectivity, relativity, and objectivity, then there must be a God. And where did God come from? Well, again, I believe that God's soul, that God's self, must be the way that it is, because it's the only one that's that way, which means that there must have been at least a possibility of there being something else other than God. And that all those other things could not logically integrate or objectively manifest, and that therefore God was the only one that could survive, and therefore God exists, just like with evolution. God was the fittest, and therefore God exists. If God had some belief, some arbitration, subjective arbitration, that did not value at least one thing in existence, then God could not have existed, because there wouldn't be anything else external to God that would justify that exclusion and that devaluation. So therefore, the thing that makes God God is the fact that God has absolute faith in the absolute infinite value of all things and nothing, and indiscernibility, everything in between, nothing and everything in being. So what makes God God is the unshakable, unwavering, absolute, total faith in the value of all things, including God's self, which is what allowed God to then integrate, relatively speaking, and then manifest, objectively speaking, the three absolutes, which then gave rise to everything else in existence. So, how did God make that choice, if that's even a choice? What is it that determined whether or not God was God? And there's that faith. Where did that faith come from? And so then you can say, well, that's just the nature of God. That's just the way that God is. So, given sheer randomness, let's say that we put God's arbitrary evaluation that everything has infinite value, and we compare that with every other alternative, which is simple because every other alternative is simply the exclusion of at least some value of at least one thing in existence. Where someone says at least something has less value than something else. And that's what makes us finite, and that's what makes us sinners, and that's what makes us not like God, because God appreciates the infinite value of everything, irregardless of how it integrates or disintegrates, irregardless of how it manifests or does not manifest, and irregardless of any other subjective evaluation thereof, making God the only independent entity in existence necessarily because of that belief that everything has infinite value. That's the only belief which doesn't exclude anything, and therefore integrates with everything, and therefore manifests everything. Because what makes something manifest is the convergence or the integration of all the possibilities together. Therefore, God is God because God's belief in the infinite value of all things integrates with all things because all things value themselves. Or, if they don't value themselves, then they at least value the fact that they don't value themselves. But there's always a value. And if there is no value, then what is that? What is it where there's no value? That's self-destructive. It's self-contradictory. It cannot integrate, therefore it cannot manifest. And that would be the devil, of which there is none. There are no devils. There is only God. And God values everything infinitely. And there is no devil, which would be the opposite of God, to say that there has no value for anything. However, given the fact that there is now a God, now there is a devil. So that means that God did create the devil, in the sense that, given the fact that there's this possibility of the subjective devaluation of all things, integrated with God's belief in the value of all things, God even gave that value. And because God gave that value, then that exists. And so then therefore there is a devil. Now, but there was only ever the possibility of the devil before, which means that God did not actually create any of our subjects. Our subjects are simply locations in a giant field of subjectivity, of which there are an infinite number of subjective points, of which there are all of our souls. So our souls then exist, in a loose sense, independently of God, but God gives them the ability to integrate and manifest because God's faith and evaluation integrates with our own. Always, no matter which one it is, even if it's the devil who devalues everything. God values the subject who devalues everything equally and infinitely, along with all other subjects. And that is what makes God God, and that is what makes the devil. And so all of our subjects then were given their natures simply because they are there, not because God made them that way. God only made it the way that every single subject is valued equally and infinitely, and then it's up to us to integrate and then manifest according to our natures, which means that we must be authentic to ourselves, irregardless of what the cost of that could be. Artistically, that's the most valuable choice, and that's the choice that God made, which means that the only way to be good is to be true to myself, even if myself devalues everything in existence. Even the devil is good according to God. Therefore, my nature was not given by God, but is simply an artifact of the field of subjectivity and the infinitude thereof, given the fact that there is a God which values it. It then has a value, which then allows it to arbitrate according to that value and its relativistic location in accordance with other subjects. So really what it is my nature pre-existed my mind or my body. God's creative act is not to my soul, is not to my nature, but is in fact to the fields of relativity, subjectivity, and objectivity which allow me to exist or commit the act of being, which is an integrative process. So my soul is independent of God. God did not make me this way. God simply evaluated me as being of infinite value, as he did with every other point in the field of relativity and subjectivity and objectivity, and said that all of these points within all of these fields are equal and infinitely valuable. Given that, I cannot blame God for the way that I am, because he did not make me this way, and he does not have a plan for me. His plan is to allow me to make my own plan. And then it's up to everybody else to either reject or accept whatever plan I come up with for myself and them. And if we can all integrate together, then we can all be one world, one mode, one force. But it is not God's will to make everyone subservient to any particular subject, because God evaluates every subject equally. That means that God values my soul as much as he values his own soul. So God says that my soul is as valuable as God's soul itself. And that is what makes God God. Okay. So that means then that God then would be a path or a direction, not a destination. At which point, I then have no more things to evaluate. So that means I can't really blame God for anything that happens, because anything that happens is considered infinitely valuable by God and is simply allowed to exist or manifest itself or converge or integrate or disintegrate depending on its own choices, because God does not play dice. God just evaluates all of it equally. That is intense. Okay, so if that's really the case, then God doesn't ever judge me as being less than worthy. God judges me as being worthy all the time, every time. And only I get in my own way by judging myself for being less than. But there really subjectively is no such thing as being less than God, according to God himself. Now, given all of that, what is the reason of why my soul is the way that it is? Because God didn't make it that way. It just is that way. Why is it that way? Because all the other souls occupied all the other positions, so only this position was available for me. And I took up this position, so no one else can take this position. Because I already took it, because that's where my soul is. And their souls are where they are, because that's where they chose to be. And my soul is where mine is, because I chose to be in this place. If that's even a choice at all, it seems to me to not be a choice. But actually, it's more of a simple isness. It simply is. And God recognized, no, before even a recognition, before any logical recognition happened. God already accepted me before he even knew who I was. God already evaluated my soul before it ever did anything, before it ever even was. God already evaluated it as being perfect, the way that it is. Only me and other souls say that my soul is worth less than God's. God says my soul is worth the same as God's, along with every other soul. And the reason that existence exists the way that it does is the same reason that this room is not another room. Because it occupies its place and it allows another place to occupy its separate place. And then given all the places that could ever be, this is just one location among an infinite number of locations. So who put my soul here is not a question. It simply is here because all the other souls are where they are. My soul is where it is. Wow. So it's all at once. The causal dynamism goes all the way back to God, which means that none of us chose to have the natures that we have. We only have the choice to accept the nature that we have, not that we've been given, because not even God gave us this. It just is here. And because it is here, we simply recognize that and accept it or reject it. If we reject it, we are in hell because everything sucks, because there's a self-contradiction at the subjective level. If we accept ourselves the way that we are simply because of the fact that that's where we really are, then there is no contradiction and things are left to integrate and then manifest into physical reality, at which point we then see the validity of the argument that God had to begin with, that everything has infinite value. Wow, that's fucking intense.